Howdy, I'm Kate Kavanaugh, and you're listening to the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast, where we're laying the groundwork for our land, ourselves, and for generations to come by looking at the way every thread of life is connected to one another. Communities above ground mirror the communities below the soil, which mirror the vast community of the cosmos. As the saying goes, as above, so below. Join me as we take a curious journey into agriculture, biology, history, spirituality, health, and so much more. I can't wait to unearth all of these incredible topics alongside you. Hi. Welcome to the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast, somewhere in transition to the Groundwork podcast, but maybe it's just the Kate Kavanaugh show. Here, we explore the threads of what it means to be humans woven into this earth. And I am your host, Kate Kavanaugh, and I am always just filled with gratitude to be here with you, whatever you're doing in these moments, whether you're driving or you're doing dishes and working around the house, or maybe you're out farming, or maybe you're sitting there and watching this. But it is always a pleasure to be here. And today we're exploring a topic that I'm finding is something that I want to create space for on this show, which is grief. And I think that so often below many of the emotions that I experience, whether that's anger or a sense of longing, that I find when I peel back the layers, that grief is there. And I find that it's something that I am reticent to touch. Even in preparing some of these episodes around grief, whether it's did one with Frances Weller, episode 98, we did one with Heidi Boucher about home funerals. They're very difficult. And I think that in the same way that death is obscured in our culture, we also don't openly discuss grief. And I think within that, so much of us haven't touched our own. And I find that touching my grief is something that feels electric, that feels difficult. And it's touching those things that I am grieving. And it's also imagining what I might grieve. But I think that this work is just incredibly important, and I want to make space for it. And I say that I share my experience in preparing these episodes because I think that it is a brave thing to go in and to touch our grief. And I just want to reflect back to you, if you're here and looking to examine this a little bit, looking to feel this, or just looking to understand it, what a big emotion it is, and that you are not alone in feeling it. And my guest today is Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor, who is a grief researcher, and her two books, The Grieving Brain and just released The Grieving Body, are an incredible exploration of how and where we grieve. And in this instance, in The Grieving Body, the deep physiological effects that come with grief. And I think that one of the things that we touch on in this episode is, while the mechanisms of grief within the body are particularly interesting, the most important thing that I found in this work was that it normalizes these incredible shifts that our grieving bodies go through in a way where we might be concerned, we might not understand what's happening within our body. And I got a very, very, very small taste of this the last 2 years. I was alone here on the farm for the better part of 2 years. And there was a lot of grief for me, not in an acute sense of loss, but in terms of not having a person here, being alone, and kind of having some grieves from a while ago in my life sort of rise to the surface like cream on the top of milk. And some of the changes that my body went through, even in that level of grief, were really profound. And I've talked about this, but my blood glucose control was zilch. It was sort of off the charts, and my heart rate came up and my heart rate variability came down. And I was really struck at just what a body does in response to life. And I think that so often we're reaching for what's going on inside of our bodies. And this grief is one of those many things. And in the Grieving Body, in Dr. Mary Frances's research, she really looks at what happens immediately following big losses within our lives. She talks about the learning process of grief and how we can support our body. In this episode, we also talk a lot about how to be a good support person for people that are grieving, which I think is incredibly important. We are not a grief literate society. We don't always know what to say. And in this episode, Dr. Mary Frances and I really explore some of what it might mean to just be there, to just be steady in the face of grief. And she shares some really beautiful stories about what that might mean. And I found something about Mary Frances herself to be of comfort, and the way that she speaks about grief and her work both in the Grieving Body and the Grieving Brain is absolutely incredible. The body of research that she has contributed to grief, but I think also the compassion and the kindness that she contributes, and the normalizing of this process that we all go through is really incredible. And so I'm so grateful to have her on the show. And I just want you to be able to dig right in. And so without further ado, here is Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor with her new book, The Grieving Body: How the Stress of Loss Can Be an Opportunity for Healing, which is out today, February 11th. And thank you for tuning in. Actually thinking about this, how to start a podcast is a very, very funny little thing. And I often drop just right into somebody's work without a little bit of preamble. But I wanted to ask you how you came to grief. And I know that you talk about this in both books, but you've been working in grief for quite some time, I think. And while it's become a little bit more, I think we've become a little bit more aware of grief, I feel that at the time you started, it was something that was definitely pulsing a little bit beneath awareness.
That is true. And you're right. I've actually been teaching a psychology of death and loss course since 1999. And I've really seen changes over that time. I mean, of course, there have always been people whose central work was around death, loss, and grief. And my own background includes hospice training. And those were in many ways the clinicians and researchers who were sort of holding the knowledge for us, so to speak. And it has really, our willingness to talk about grief has just exponentially grown in the last couple of decades. And I would say even more so in the last few years. And of course, unfortunately, some of that is because of events in our life, cultural events, the pandemic, and so forth. But I think we often come to grief research when something in our own life has sparked interest or touched us deeply. And that's true for me as well. So in my own life, I was already in graduate school, but my mother passed away when I was in my early 20s. And she had had a terminal illness for a very long time. And so for me, I was, studying to be a clinical psychologist, and I felt maybe just more comfortable with people who were grieving because it felt familiar, I guess. And it felt like an area that really needed attention in psychology research. Many people were mystified that I could make a whole career out of studying grief, so there was a bit of a challenge there professionally, which of course I realized there was plenty that we didn't know, that I didn't know as I was, going through my mom's illness and then her loss. But I think hopefully that has made me a little bit more attuned to the research participants in my lab, so that, I'm doing neuroimaging studies or I'm taking blood draws. And I'm also trying to figure out how that physiological experience maps onto their psychological experience.
Yes. And this is what this book that I think at the time of this podcast release will be out, The Grieving Body, the subtext, how the stress of loss can be an opportunity for healing. This is the deep exploration that happens here. And I just want to say, I really appreciate the way that you infuse some of your personal story into both The Grieving Body and The Grieving Brain, which is the book that preceded it. And even just having read both of them, you can see a little bit of the evolution of your relationship with your mother, and you share some things that were very familiar to me in my own relationship with my mother, that I was very appreciative of, and appreciative to see your sort of evolution throughout the two books. So
that's really good to hear. As scientists, of course, we're not trained to talk about our personal experience, but I've recognized that science communication is in part about, why is this information useful, right? Yes. How would I live my life differently if I knew what you're going to tell me? And often it is through explaining how I understand the world differently because of the research that I'm steeped in, day in and day out, that makes the information impactful. And so it took me a while to sort of find my voice in talking about my own lived experience. But, as a clinician, as a therapist, we're trained only to disclose things when there's a point, right? When it forwards something in the relationship. And so hopefully people who are reading the book, they have that experience. Oh, she's telling me this so that I'll understand, why this is relevant, or she's telling me this so that I can trust that she understands what I've been through.
Yes, there was something that felt very connective about it. And I think that story is such a beautiful vehicle for science communication, as you so mentioned, to kind of give it that personal touch. And you do it very, very deftly.
Thank you.
I wondered if we might start. You had this great sentence towards the beginning of the book that we cannot study grief and loss without first studying love and bonding. And I absolutely loved this. Something that we've explored a lot on the podcast is the relationship between self and other. We've looked at commensal bacteria and how so many of the cells that occupy our body, both within and without, are not our own. The exchange of gases, even between plants. I'm looking at my house plant right here and thinking about that I'm breathing in some of the oxygen that it's putting off, and how there's this constant overlap between us and our environment. And I pulled out of the book in my notes here this great illustration of self or other as we merge with a loved one. There is this big overlap between these two circles, and we form, and I loved this so much, you talk about forming an us. And so I wondered if we might start there with love and bonding and attachment. I just want to take a short pause from our interview with Dr. Mary Francis to talk about one of our sponsors today. Redmond Real Salt is a mine-to-table salt right here in the USA. They're based in Utah, and they pull salt from the ancient Sundance Sea. And I got to stand in one of their mines surrounded by salt. And it is absolutely incredible to be surrounded by this material from the Jurassic period that is packed full of 60 plus trace minerals. And you can find their salt in everything from little tiny pocket shakers to 25-pound bags, which I know is what I need. And I have to say, so Redmond has been my go-to salt for years, and I love working with them, not just because their salt is mineral rich and delicious, but because they work hard to build community both near and far, and they put a lot of purpose into their salt. If you're a fan of their Relight electrolyte powder, which is the best on the market, in my opinion, it is full of their Redmond salt, magnesium glycinate, which is very bioavailable, coconut water powder, and some of the best flavors. Right now, I am loving the strawberry lemonade. They also have something very new, which is their Relight Kids line. Whether you have kids or you're just a kid at heart, I love this lower sodium formula, especially right now in the dark winter days. It is colorful and fun, made possible with organic fruit and vegetable powders, and it's been a big part of me keeping me hydrated in the winter because there's all these dehydrating forces, right? I have my wood stove going, we have heater going, and I'm still exercising, and so we still need this replenishment of electrolytes even here in the depth of winter, and this just brightens up my day. And so right now, between that and being in the thick of that last season of root vegetables and big stews and braises, I'm just with my Redmond salt all the time. And I am so thankful to have been working with them for the past year. You can get 15% off by going to redmond.life and using discount code mindbodysoil_15 for 15% off. Again, go to redmond.life, use code mindbodysoil_15, and you'll get 15% off the incredible Redmond Real Salt. Now back to our interview with Dr. Mary Francis.
In order to think about what has been lost, what is missing, I think we first have to understand what is there, right? You can't really understand why something feels like there's a hole in you if you didn't understand how that bond fit together in the first place. And so I think this has helped to really reveal for me. We think of ourselves as ending, at our skin. We think of ourselves as sort of, it goes from the inner me to the edge of my skin, and that's myself. But in reality, research is suggesting that actually we form a system. This us is sort of these two orbiting bodies, isn't it? And that has real physiological consequences. So, we can think of the idea that when I go home from work and I get a hug from my partner, my blood pressure goes down a little bit, my heart rate goes down a little bit, and I can count on that, right? Like I know that that's going to happen. So there's also this predicted sort of habit quality that really we are external pacemakers for each other.
Oh, I love that.
To some degree, that's just how things are, and it's only revealed when that external pacemaker is missing, right?
Yes.
Is gone. That suddenly we see difficulty with cardiovascular regulation, and that's sort of it's not necessarily that there's something just that's been added as a stress, but rather that something we expect as a part of our regulation is taken away.
Yeah. I really loved this part of exploring this, and just to pull another little quote from you talked about that your desire to do this research. You said that it comes from the fascination and wonder and awe that two separate bodies can come together through attachment in this way, tethered through invisible bonds, creating our deepest motivations and strongest emotions, transcending time and space.
Yeah.
And I think that anybody who has experienced attachment with another being or a group of beings, a community, knows this feeling of being held, that our social attachments give us, both in infancy and beyond. And I was heartened too that you talked about the way in which infants form this attachment and form this sort of map and understanding of where their loved ones are as they co-regulate with their
Mhm.
loved ones.
Yeah. It's so clear, in moments when we need attachment the most, it's sort of most revealed, right? So the idea of it's sometimes called kangaroo care, right? Where an infant is placed on the skin of the mother on her chest. So skin to skin contact has enormous benefits for an infant being able to regulate their physiological systems, their temperature and their heart rate and so forth. And also it buffers their pain response.
Mhm.
And so we know that, in infants who are, still learning how to regulate, that external regulation matters enormously. And we see it in the very elderly as well, something called failure to thrive.
Mm.
It's not a disease per se, but when elderly people are isolated and aren't getting physical contact, we see their immune system start to decline and frailty start to worsen. And it is this, they're not able to regulate their system uh, in the same way that they could if there was this external support of another loving being with them.
Yeah, and physical touch as well is
Yeah.
something that I'm hearing.
Yeah.
Was to share a little personal anecdote that might be even a little embarrassing. My husband and I like to work out together,
Mhm.
and at the beginning we do something called tummy to tummy time, and we just kind of press our stomachs up against one another, and we both
That's
find this sort of,
wonderful.
or it's a little silly, but we've talked about this sort of regulation of
Yeah.
touch within
Yes.
that, and it's skin to skin, and sometimes
Yeah.
we'll do it in the kitchen. We'll just sort of bump bellies
Yes.
as this moment of touch, because I really do
Exactly.
believe that it and what you're talking about in this book is just how powerful that sense of co-regulation is,
Yeah.
even beyond infancy.
And it's in at multiple levels, isn't it? So we joke, my partner and I love to go for a walk. We go for a walk most evenings, and there's something about we're going in the same direction. We end
Mm.
up getting in this entrained pace.
Yes.
We've done it for so long. I always stand on the same side as him, and I know
Yes.
how wide the corner he's going to take. And we joke that it's our form of dancing. We
Yes.
don't really dance together, but we walk together, and it doesn't even need to be eye contact, but we're sharing this. We're looking at the environment together and sort of noticing the change of seasons and birds, and it's just it's an entrainment
Mhm.
that helps us regulate.
Yeah, I went for a walk with my husband this afternoon, and we synced right up.
Right up, yeah.
I want to transition a little bit into the body, but I think first I wanted to pause at this place around grieving as learning. I
Mm.
was really struck by this, and it wasn't something I had ever considered
Mhm.
in grief, that this is a process of
Mhm.
learning, and
Yeah.
I just wondered if you could speak to that a little bit.
It's very interesting. I did the first neuroimaging study of bereavement that was published back in 2003, and it's interesting in the moment that we had folks bring in a photograph of the person who had died, and then we showed them that photograph on goggles as they were laying in the neuroimaging scanner,
Ah,
and also photos of a stranger, and sort of looked at their brain activity as they were thinking about their loved one. But what was so interesting was that at the end of the study, I realized we had a snapshot in time. We had a study of what the brain was doing in that moment of grief, but that many of my questions were really about grieving right? About what
Yes.
changes, where I would
Yes.
need them to be coming multiple times to the scanner to see how their brain activity was changing over time. And it made me realize that a single wave of grief is not really the same thing as the trajectory of grieving. And that part of that is because we're learning. We're learning, wow, this person is really gone and they're really not coming back. And what does that mean? Like, who am I and how do I function in the world? And all of that is a learning process. And hopefully also just using that lens makes it a little more familiar as well. We've been learning since the day we were born, right? We have a whole organ devoted to helping us to learn. But I think recognizing that grieving is just our natural way of coming to terms with the fact, the painful reality that this person is not walking this earth any longer. And how do we transform our understanding of ourselves, our lives, the chapters of our lives, and our inner relationship with this person, given that that is the present reality we find ourselves in? How do we restore a meaningful life?
I want to tease at two pieces that you just said. And one thing that struck me in reading the book was that you talk about the stress processes of loss itself, but also what you just said, this restoration, right?
Yeah.
That grief is an ongoing, forever process.
Yes.
And I think within that, you said something else, and this actually came up during another podcast I did about home funerals with Heidi Boucher.
Oh, wonderful.
And we talked about the transformation of the relationship
Yeah.
with the person that you've lost. And it really struck me at the time, and it struck me again in reading The Grieving Body, that this is a transformation of our experience and our learning process.
Yeah.
And it is also still very much a relationship
Yes.
between us and this person, but that
Yes.
relationship has been alchemized into something very different.
That's exactly right. And that this person, our mental representation of this person, the part that we carry around in our head, they don't have to be in our presence. So, you and I right now, if we think about our partner, that has an effect on our body, right? We know from research, for example, that if someone, has to, because of a study they're in, they have to stick their hand in really ice cold water. If they think about their loved one, it buffers that pain response as much as if the person is in the room, right? So we already know while that person is even alive, we have an internal relationship with them. And when the person dies in the world, when their body physically dies, that doesn't mean that internal relationship goes away. It can continue to have impacts on us as we draw on our transformed relationship with that person. But it takes time because it's not the same thing, right?
Yes.
And we have to understand, how do I call on this relationship without it overwhelming me with sadness? How do I come to find a way to interact with that person internally, without it causing me as much distress as comfort, right? And that's a long process and very unique for each person. Just as every relationship is completely unique, that transformation is going to be unique as well.
Yeah. Well, you explained that so beautifully. And I think actually the one thing that I really want to tug on for myself too is we already have an embodied relationship, even while our loved ones are still here, where they are inside of us, right?
Yes.
It's that component that is us, that is the voice in our head, and that remains.
That's right.
I want to transition to the body. And, as I was thinking about this, Rilke, the poet Rilke, if you're familiar.
Marvelous. Yes.
Often comes up when we speak about grief and just kind of has become a bit of an Easter egg on the podcast. And I had a quote from Rilke that we haven't discussed in grief that really called to mind your work. So if you don't mind me reading just a short piece. Okay. It is still always that death which continues inside of me, which works in me, which transforms my heart, which deepens the red of my blood, which weighs down the life that had been ours so that it may become a bittersweet drop coursing through my veins and penetrating everything, and which ought to be mine forever.
Mm. Mm.
I loved
Beautiful.
this because it brought it into the body.
It does. Yeah.
And I think I was really struck. I had read The Grieving Brain, and when I saw that this was coming out, I was really struck because I think we think of grief as an emotional process.
That's right.
And so often relegate emotions to the mind
Right.
and this sort of mind-body duality split that
Yes.
you beautifully talk about is really a whole.
Yeah.
But that there is this embodied and physiological, many different physiological responses to
Yes,
grief.
that's right. And what's fascinating is that, part of the reason we know this to be true, that grief is physiological as well, is that we see physiology change and behavior change even in animals where they don't necessarily have the thoughts or at least the self-report of thoughts. And so we can see some of these same behaviors and some of the same physiological changes when there is the loss of someone, some being to which we are bonded. In infants, we can see it in birds, we can see it in, any kind of social mammal.
Dogs, when my husband goes out of
Yes.
town, he is our dog's person.
Yes.
And when he leaves for 2 weeks, I see
Yes.
her sadness and her grief
Yes.
and her longing.
That's right. Exactly. And the reason that I think this is so worth knowing is not just, isn't that a curious fact? But to the degree I think that we understand first that grief is a natural physiological response. That makes us feel more normal. Like,
Yes.
why is my gut so upset? Well, this is part of how the body figures out how to regulate, But almost more importantly, when we have an understanding of how grieving works, it gives us opportunity to work with the grieving instead of against it. We can work with our body instead of against it. If we believe this is how it's supposed to happen, this is how it's supposed to work, then I think you're a little less angry with your gut, for example, right? You maybe have a little more compassion, like, oh, I see, your commensal bacteria is trying to find its way, and it's going to take a while, gut. I'm sorry. And maybe I can eat some more yogurt and that will help, I just think that thinking about how we support a grieving body gives us more opportunities for support than, for the body and mind.
I want to thank you for this because what I found that one of the many effects the book had on me was a normalizing effect.
Good.
And I actually think that normalizing is one of the greatest gifts we can give one another as a community, of saying, hey, this is normal. This is okay.
It's awful and it's how it goes,
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that removes shame, which is this piece that we really, that I wouldn't want for anybody to carry in addition to the weight of loss.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I want to, you said working with the body. And this is something you've struggled with chronic illness. I know you speak a little bit about this too. And something that I'm still in process with in my life is always coming to that my body and I are going the same place.
That's right. Yes.
And we're working together. And you have this little sentence in the book, and you say that our stress response is our body's way of communicating what it is taxed by and what it needs to regain balance.
Yeah.
And so that so many of these physiological manifestations of grief are our body telling us a little bit about what it might need, and as well as processing and sort of, even I came back to the word metabolizing this information.
Yeah. I think about this idea of a body budget. And the reason that I particularly like that word, as you alluded to, I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in my 20s, and I have a family history of multiple sclerosis, so I can tell you that my experience has been more benign than many people, but it does mean that I have to work with my body if I'm going to pursue any of my goals. And that's been a lifelong learning. What does it mean that I don't know each morning how much I can do? How on earth do you make a calendar if you don't know what your day is going to be like? And for me, the analogy there for people who are grieving, if you wake up and you have no idea what the day holds for you emotionally, just the uncertainty of that is very difficult. And so I think this idea of a body budget, that your physical sensations, your emotions, your thinking patterns are kind of a readout of how the system is doing. It is, you get your credit card bill and you sort of get a readout of how your budget is going. And what we know is that, if you don't even bother to open the credit card bill, you're certainly not going to make good financial decisions, right? So it's important to pause and actually listen to what the readout is. What are your emotions? Where is that pain in your body? Or what are your thoughts doing? Are they racing around? But then in addition, over time, we can learn how to spend our budget wisely in a way that aligns with our values or our goals. And if it means, for me, I have to take a nap every day. And that took me a long time to accept. But the reality is, if I restore the budget for 30 minutes, in the middle of the day, I actually have a much better budget all afternoon. And so all those cultural messages that, napping is a sign of being lazy, or I couldn't possibly nap because I'm a professor, like how that sentence came to me, I have no idea, but there it is, right? And so learning what are the authentic ways to make your body budget work, given that you are a person who is grieving, or you are a person who has a chronic illness. That's the authenticity of living the body and the life that you are in.
I love this, and I call these spoons oftentimes. How many spoons I have in a day.
Yes,
and
yes. Exactly.
Just as a way of considering this, and the things that give spoons.
Yes.
And the things that are particularly require quite a few spoons.
Yeah.
And how to balance this. And I think that sometimes, and I think you mentioned something that's poignant, we have such a outlook of how productive can I be, and my worth is so deeply tied to my productivity. Right. Mm-hmm. And I can't think of anything more antithetical to what it is to need to grieve than the perceived demands that we and our society and our culture have placed on us when our spoons or our budget has been reduced.
That's right. That's right. And interestingly to me, this comes up a lot around having brain fog. And I should say up front that what we know as neuropsychologists is that brain fog means a lot of different things to different people. Mm-hmm. So it's even a little hard to study, because for one person that means, forgetting where they parked their car. And for another person that means you can't concentrate and figure out your taxes. These are actually different cognitive parts of our brain and mind. But regardless, the difficulties with thinking that many grieving people have, we think of that as we don't have as many spoons, so to speak. But part of it is also that our spoons are busy doing other things, right? So it isn't even necessarily that we are less, but that very important understanding of the world at a subconscious level is having to be processed in the background, right? So, you're not broken. Your brain is not broken. It's just busy. Yes. It's busy figuring out, oh, I just put soy milk in the grocery cart because my daughter is vegan. oh, wait, I don't have to buy soy milk anymore because my daughter isn't here. Right? Think of all that your brain has to go through
Yeah.
in that 30 seconds of picking up soy milk and
Mm.
putting it back on the shelf, right? Your brain has gone through umpteen, mental gymnastics. So it isn't so much that we are less or that we're not able to think. It's that we're busy thinking and understanding other things in the background.
Yes, absolutely. I really appreciate that perspective, and I think that within that too, and you look at this in the way that the body is trying to
Yes,
re-regulate, and the way
that's
that
right.
that thought process, that 30-second moment in the grocery store, is affecting our endocrine system
That's
and our
right.
heart and
Hmm.
our immune system
Hmm.
and our lungs and our
Yeah.
liver. That this is a systems wide process
Yes.
that spoons that energy
Yeah.
that care is going to.
Hmm. That's exactly right. Yeah,
Yeah.
it isn't anything mental is considered through the budget of the body too. Yeah.
Yeah. And you do a really fantastic job of going through all of these different systems, and I'm going to implore
Thank
people
you.
to read the book
Mhm.
and exploring some of the really profound impacts and the very specific research in
Yeah.
all of these different systems, as well
Yeah.
as the brain, and talking about, I actually really appreciated your piece about brain fog,
Yeah.
and some of its many multifactorial
Hmm.
potential spaces that it's coming from, and kind of giving a little peek into those biological processes that we might not be aware of, but
Yeah.
might be deeply feeling the effects of in our grief.
Yeah. I think the other reason for me, so I think if you only were to get maybe a third of the way through the book, you might think, well, why do I need to know all this?
Mm.
Why is she going on and
Hmm.
on about this? And I think for me, it's because our body budget is what enables us to do purposeful things, right?
Mm.
It's what enables us to pursue the goals and activities and values that we hold deeply. It's that motivation.
Mm.
And by understanding a little bit more about how our body works and how our body reacts during loss, it gives us more avenues in to supporting the system,
Yeah.
right? So that if you don't have much appetite and you understand, gosh, that's actually pretty common in grieving. So now I just have to deal with the fact that I don't have much appetite, then you might decide, I think Mary Frances needs
Mm.
healthier snacks. I think she's not going to be able to eat a full meal. And so I think I need to get some really healthy granola bars and, milk or whatever so that I can work with the fact that I just don't have much appetite and still get a little nutrition along the way. Because the nutrition then will also support my body and brain as I deal with the next situation that comes up. So just understanding how the body works and how it works with the mind, I think helps us to support the whole system as we, work our way through this learning curve.
Yeah. I often describe myself as a why kid. I'm
Mm,
still asking, but why? But why?
yes.
But why? And I
Mhm.
find a lot of reason and purpose within the why, that
Mhm.
understanding the mechanism,
Yeah.
understanding what is happening at a sort of cellular and
Yeah.
biological level
Yeah.
really helps me have some purpose, just like you said,
Yeah.
in some of the steps I might take towards better supporting
Yeah.
my body
Yes.
and better supporting myself.
Mhm.
And I wanna offer back to you one thing that I'm
Yeah.
not in an acute process of grief
Yeah.
right now, right? Like, I'm
Mhm.
not in that acute, but you offer something throughout the book time and again that I think that this falls into too, which is to be kind to ourselves. And I
Yeah.
think that in understanding that why,
Yes.
that biological process,
Mhm.
it helps us be kind to ourselves.
Yes.
Because like
Yeah.
we said earlier, you have this understanding that this is normal
That's
and
right.
that the body is also going through this transformation.
That's right. And I think this, what many readers tell me is that it feels very validating to hear these things, to
Yes.
hear it, in research and so forth. And I don't think it should require physiological data for us to feel that it's, real or something. But the reality is that many of us do feel validated when we see that it's happening in our body, and when we can see that it's happening on average across,
Yeah.
hundreds of thousands of people who've been in research studies. There is something very validating. Oh, it's not just me. And that can help us to be kind to ourselves and kind to others who are grieving.
Yeah, this actually brings me to one of my next big topics here, which is I actually and I've said this a lot on the course of the podcast. I really feel that we are herd animals at heart,
Yes.
right? I'm a farmer.
Mhm.
Peek outside, I can see my goats,
Yeah.
and we evolved in a space around community, that there was a
Yes.
really big community. And I think that within that community, something that we really miss in modern days, oftentimes, for those of us that don't have as wide of a community, is to see others in the many processes that life brings them to, and grief
Yeah.
being one, and to see that process in order to normalize it.
Yeah.
And within seeing it and witnessing it and participating in it, in holding others
Yeah.
in their grief process, it informs something about how we might eventually go through that same process. And and I think it makes it feel less alone. And we're missing that community piece often.
Yeah. The experience of grief is universal, but the expression of what we do when we're grieving and how we respond when others are grieving is so widely variable across periods of history, across cultures, and so forth. And I think we are in a moment in sort of westernized, medicalized, culture where many of us, grief is behind doors, death is behind doors, and it means that we don't get some of the experiences to learn from, of how this goes. And I think it can be interesting to read about, to experience other cultures and how they approach things very differently. I live in Tucson, Arizona, and so we're about an hour from the Mexico border. And one of the influences that we see around here is this celebration of Dia de los Muertos. And it is such a celebration, but it is every year. Every year you think about that person who's died, and you make their favorite food, and you lay out the altar, so that you can come together and the family can be in a place together to think about them. And this idea that there's just a natural time when you get to talk about it, and you get to reestablish that relationship with your your transforming ancestor, and just that it's so normal, that this comes around every year and no one is surprised that everyone cries, is such a different way of approaching it. And, I could go on and on. Of course, there are millions of different traditions that reveal to us the nature of what it means to be human and grieving, and what that looks like, and how we can respond to that.
Yeah, I love that. The nature of, because I think that our grief is very wonderfully human.
Yes.
And those rituals, I know I talked with Frances Weller a couple months back, and we got to dive into some of what it might mean to create ritual around
Yeah.
this.
Wonderful.
Because I think, and I'll pull a quote from the Grieving Body from your book. You said you're working towards a world where no one grieves alone.
Yeah.
And this really, really struck me in that you talk a little bit about the physiological, we talked about touch a little bit here at the open,
Yeah.
but that in that process of transforming our relationship and finding a little bit of the new balance after grief, that there's a lot that a community has to offer us,
Yeah.
even in terms of just our hormonal outlay in
Mhm.
response to being in community
Yeah.
with them.
Yeah. There's a story that's actually it's not actually a story. It's from a research study that I talked about in the first book, in the Grieving Brain, that just really sticks with me. And it is the fact that in primate colonies, and I mean, natural, these are scientists that go out and observe natural existing primate colonies. That the death of an infant is, of course, very common, just as it was for human primates. Infant mortality is quite high. And the observations over time of what mothers do when their infant dies, what primate mothers do when their infant dies, and then how the troop also responds. And so in particular, often the mother will carry the deceased infant for a long time.
Yes.
And there's wide individual variations in how long they carry this deceased infant. But what is fascinating is in primate colonies, there's a hierarchy, right, of like sort of who gets to groom who. It's like the high school sort of popularity or something, right, where A gets to groom B and C, but C can't groom A. Anyway, what's so interesting is during this time, the bereaved mother often stops grooming herself. Well, for primates, there's health consequences for that.
Yeah.
To groom is also to remove parasites and
Yeah.
so forth. And what's interesting, what's been in these observations, these scientific observations, is that suddenly the hierarchy is gone. Anyone can groom the grieving mother. And it's so interesting to think, customs have to change in that moment when we're supporting the health of this grieving body, right? And
Yes.
and that when she relinquishes the deceased infant and comes back to the troop, the rules all go back into effect again, right? So just so fascinating. Like, this is a moment where we step out of time, where we step out of habit, and we do things differently for one another to support as a community what that process is like.
Yes. I mean, what a beautiful story. I mean, and
So
what a
moving.
beautiful, and I think that those opportunities to see the universality of grief reflected
Yeah.
in animals other than the human animal,
Yeah.
I think are very profound.
Yeah.
And I want to bring in one piece that I love that you said as a reminder that sharing our grief can be a kindness. This is a quote
Yes.
from you.
Yeah.
And I think that so often because death itself is behind closed doors, we feel that the weight of what we are feeling, and you talk about the etymology of grief, to be
Gravity.
burden, gravity, right?
Yeah.
That the weight of what we are feeling, that it's ours alone to carry. And I
Yeah.
know, as somebody who struggles with having any request feel like an imposition, right?
Yes.
That you don't want to put that on someone else.
Yes.
But you remind us in this quote, and I love this, that sharing our grief can be a kindness.
Yes, it connects us in a unique way. And I even just recently, I've thought a lot about, why is it so difficult to support someone who's grieving, right? You'd think this would be a super obvious thing to do. And I think a lot about when we are experiencing grief, it's like the volume dial gets turned up on all the emotions, not
Yes.
just sadness, but anger and guilt and blame and yearning and that can be tough on relationships. And it can, as a person standing grief adjacent, it can make you very nervous. I don't want to make this person seems really angry. I don't quite know how to interact with that. And even in our lab, we have such courageous participants who are willing to share their experience with us so that we can understand better what are the patterns across humans. But we'll have situations, where a participant is really angry about something and one of our graduate assistants will feel so terrible. I think maybe I scheduled them for the wrong time, but I don't think that I did. And we have to sort of pause and say, this is partly about they're just grieving and they're just angry. And, you happen to be in the room. It's not necessarily your fault, but it also doesn't mean you shouldn't be in the room.
Exactly.
Right? So I think the story about this that really sticks with me, this is from one of my undergraduates in my psychology of death and loss class. She told me this story about that she and her boyfriend lived next door to an older couple. And they realized that he had died in the couple. And so around Christmas time, her boyfriend had gone next door and knocked on the door and said, "Hey, I know your husband used to put up the Christmas lights. Would you like me to do that this year?" And the woman said, "No, I don't want that," and slammed the door. And he just felt awful. Oh my God, I've done totally the wrong thing. How could I be so insensitive? I can't even believe I've done that. I feel awful, right? And 24 hours later, she came over and knocked on the door and she said, "I'm so sorry. I just cannot stand that he can't do that now. And of course, I would like you to put up the lights with me. And can I tell you stories about how he did it and why we did it this way?" And, but the idea that we don't know what the impact is. Of course, she felt incredibly touched that this young man would notice and offer. And she was also just really angry in that moment. Yeah. So as those of us who are supporting, the idea isn't that we get to change their experience, just that we get to be there through it with them,
Yes, there's this, that story brought tears to my eyes. Because it does. It turns up the volume, right? It turns up the volume on everything. And I think that again, as a community, one of the things we have the opportunity to do is to be consistent, to just make a space and to keep that space, even if it's uncomfortable, right?
Yes, that's right.
Even if it's uncomfortable for us. And I was thinking about even her bravery to come back. Would I have been brave enough?
Would I have been brave enough having yelled at my neighbor?
Would I have been brave enough? Like, what an incredible act of bravery to go back and to say, "Wait a minute, I'm sorry, and this is what's going on," and just the tenderness of what it means when we can make space.
Yes, that's right. And sort of, I've not put it quite in these terms before, but she's not able to regulate her emotions either, right? In that moment. And to the degree that we could absorb, in our best moments, that we could absorb that dysregulation and just sort of allow the space and time and grace for it to just be true. This is what happened, Now, when we're grief adjacent, we also have to care for ourselves. I'm not suggesting that this is, going to look the same in every moment and forever, but it helps me to think, when someone is dysregulated, am I able to help in any way? Not even help, not because I need to solve something. Am I able to be a rock for them, right? I don't necessarily have to do something to simply be solid for a person.
Yes. I actually think that's a really critical distinction because I think that actually, in some ways, I think this harkens back to being a productivity-based society.
Right.
That our desire to fix, to set that to the side, that this cannot be fixed.
Right.
And I think both griever and grief adjacent feels the the despair,
Yes, that's
the
it.
despair in that it can't be fixed, but
That's
to
right.
allow that to be
That's
and to
right.
just
And
make space.
exactly. And to also allow that that despair is simply true, right? So I think one of the things that
Mm,
understanding protest and despair has really helped me
mm,
is to think there's actually a reason that we have protest and despair,
mm.
right? So protest is this, I can't believe, oh, I can't believe it. Oh no, they're gone. This agitated, running around, so activated. I have to find them. I have to search for them. I have to cry and wail so they'll come and get me.
Yeah.
And despair is, oh no, they're gone, right? Which is the withdrawn realization, which physically even just feels so different. But the whole thing is that we see this, like I say, even in animals and infants, that despair is that moment where you realize running around and wailing isn't going to change anything. And so despair has a utility. So it's okay to support someone just in being in that realization moment. But of course, despair isn't the end of the story either, right? So despair leaves out hope because despair says, wow, this is really true, and therefore I'm going to feel like this forever. But of course, you're not going to feel that moment of despair forever. It will still be true, and you will also restore a life where it is true and other things are true as well. And so I sometimes think about the idea that we can support someone in having that moment of despair and not try to change their mind. They're right. They're not coming back. And we can say, I don't know what your future looks like, but I can tell you that I will be here until we figure it out together. I can't
Yes.
solve it for you, but I can be here next to you.
Yes. Yeah. And how profound it is to have, I think, this sort of life cycle of
Mhm.
grief,
Yes.
this sort of composting
Yes.
process that we're
Mhm.
going through, right?
Yeah.
It's very unknown.
Mhm.
Everything about
Yes.
this is unknown.
Mhm.
And so what a gift to be given. You may not know so many things right now. You may not
Yeah.
know anything right now,
Right.
but please know that I will be here. And
Yes.
what a beautiful offer of
Mhm.
consistency and
Mhm.
just staying put, just
Just
being a
being a
rock.
rock.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I do like to be clear because, previous scientific models have often made it sound like, you do this once and then you're done. So protest and despair, it's a cycle, right? Like
Yeah.
we go through this many, many,
There are
many,
ebbs
many
and flows.
times, right?
Yes.
We have protest, we have
Mm.
despair, we go back to protest, we have despair, and it's all because it's part of the learning. You didn't learn your multiplication tables all at once. You practiced many times. And so I just like to give that caveat so that people don't think, oh, well, I've had my protest moment and I've had my despair moment. Why am I not done?
And I think too that sometimes even many years later, after those more frequent cycles of protest and despair have sort of tapered off,
That's right.
still
Yes,
still they will come up,
that's right.
right? There will still be these waves, maybe the
Yes.
frequency of the wave
Yes.
has lessened, but
That's right.
waves still
That's right.
come.
Exactly. I think this idea of it is a learning curve and
Yeah.
you're going to learn new things in new situations, right? So, in my own experience with my mom having died in my 20s, I hit this point. So my mom died when she was 63, but she got stage 4 breast cancer when she was 50.
Mm.
And when I turned 50, I realized how much I look like my mom. And
Yeah.
every time I looked in the mirror, I suddenly could see her.
Yeah.
And it was like the loss happened in a new way because she was with me in a different sense,
Mhm.
that I couldn't even have begun to understand what that would feel like when I was 26. The loss was new again.
Mhm.
And I'd been, metabolizing the loss for so
Mhm.
long that it didn't throw me in the same way. It wasn't as intense or frequent, exactly as you
Yeah.
said. But it was, I had to deal with what does it mean to not have a mom when you're 50 instead of when you're 26. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, I had a moment. My dad died when I was 13, and I had a
Ah,
moment when I turned 26, but kind of really at 30, where I was like, he has been gone longer
yes.
than he
Then he
was
was
than
in
he
my
was
life.
there,
Yeah.
and there was that same sort of
Yeah.
renewal and a
Yes.
shift,
Mhm.
right? Like, just a shift in that
Mhm.
grief process.
That's right.
I There's one piece before we move on, because 'cause we've been talking a lot about grief literacy, and I wanna come back to that, but I wanna have this note here for myself: loneliness as hunger. And
Mm.
and you brought up something in the book that was very profound to me, that when we are hungry,
Mhm.
we think, "Oh, I need to eat."
Mhm.
And if we experience pain, then there's a response, "Oh, I need to care for this pain."
Yeah.
And I found it so profound, Mary Frances, that when we experience loneliness, to
Mhm.
which there is, hopefully within our lives, a space where we can reach out.
Yeah.
And I just at least know for me, I won't speak for anyone else, that when I experience loneliness, my first reach, or my second, or my third, is not, oh, let me reach out to people.
Yeah. Yeah. That in that moment, somehow currently in our society, the awareness that we feel lonely feels like a flaw, right? Feels
Yes.
like a personal flaw. Instead of, this is just a signal, like you're thirsty or you're
Yeah.
hungry or
Need to drink something. Need to eat
exactly.
something.
Yeah. I joke about, I will sit on my couch and think, why haven't my friends called? And why hasn't my partner reached out to me? And what's wrong with me? Why does this keep happening?
Yes.
I never sit on my couch and think, I'm hungry. I'm hungry again. Why does this keep happening?
Yes. Yes.
And I think about, I can anticipate that I will be hungry. So much so I make a grocery list and I go to the grocery store in
Yeah.
advance.
I
If
prep
you
food for the week.
exactly. Imagine if you thought, I might feel lonely this week. What am I doing socially that I can then look forward to in the moment that says, oh, yes, I am feeling lonely. But at 3 o'clock, on Saturday, I'm going to have coffee with so and so. And that's already been set up because I had my list and I made plans in advance.
This was profound for me, and I and I
Oh,
and I wanted to call attention to it, because I think that grief is isolating, and
yeah.
as much as I think we want to be good supporters of grief, I think that there is also that brave, and
Yes,
and it is brave, and I
it
I
is.
do want to acknowledge that brave piece of being able to recognize loneliness and reach out and do
Yeah.
that kindness of sharing our grief, and sharing our desire for
Yeah.
for connection that is so innate to
That's right.
this herd animal that
Yeah.
is the human.
And I think one way I think about this is if one's response internally to hearing this is, well, I can't reach out because of X, Y, and Z, or it wouldn't matter if I reached out because of X, Y, or Z. This is actually something you can talk about with someone, right? There are reasons we get in our own way or our circumstances get in the way, where it doesn't always happen naturally.
Yeah.
We may have learned lessons about, I'm not worthy
Yeah.
enough, or people are not trustworthy, or whatever it
Yes.
is that comes up for us. That is actually a topic that we can talk about with
Yes.
people, whether that's a therapist or a pastor or reading books about how loneliness works, or even going to the people to whom we feel some level of closeness and saying, I need to reach out and I'm really, really having
Yeah.
a hard time doing it. Can we figure out how to make that work? Which
Yes.
takes enormous courage. But I
Yes.
just want to, by jesting about it, I don't want to underestimate the difficulties that people have.
Yes, and I really appreciate you doing that, and to deepen that, this was actually a recognition point for me that
Yeah.
this is something that I need to talk about and
Right.
consider for
Yes.
myself because,
Right.
again, it is not my first, second, or third response, and in fact, something
Right.
that I find in a whole host of there is a whole cascade of
Yes.
unkindnesses in my
That's
head
right.
around
Yes.
this, and
Mhm.
so this was a point for me of, this is something I want to talk about, and so
Yeah.
and so I appreciate both the humor and
Right.
the depth of, no, this is an important
Yeah.
piece,
That's right.
that our
That's right.
loneliness is hunger.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot, and I wanna begin to wrap up. I mean, the book, and I wanna stress for people that there's so much more inside the book than this conversation here, and there's so much more of that how, and so many more great stories, I think, that really
Thank
serve
you.
as a touchstone.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you about building grief literacy. This is
Mm.
something that you said,
Mhm.
and I think that there's a couple of pieces. We talked a lot towards the end here about being a support system for grievers,
Yeah.
being grief adjacent.
Mhm.
But I just wondered a little bit about that piece
Mhm.
of grief literacy. I think both for grievers and those that are grief adjacent. And I will say that one thing that you said really struck me is that we do get this chance through grief to learn about our own relationship with our body, that
That's
is
right.
one of the many learning pieces that
Yes.
can come from this, right? Or
Yeah.
to deepen that relationship with our body that we're going to have
Yeah.
for the duration of our time here in
That's right.
this body.
That's right.
Um, but yeah, other thoughts that you have around grief literacy.
I was trained, of course, as a clinical psychologist, so my go-to way of thinking about things is sort of one-on-one, or maybe in a group, right? But I have in recent, just even in the past year or two, I've come in contact with this idea of bereavement as a public health issue, right?
Yeah.
That it isn't just a one-off individual issue, but really as a collective, as a society, we can think about how would we approach bereavement and grief support from a public health perspective. And part of that, what that means, is building this foundation of literacy, right?
Mhm.
So that understanding where should grief be introduced in education, where should
Mm.
grief be introduced in training our medical and health care professionals, where should it be introduced in our our lawyers and judges, right, who are
Wow.
continuously coping with people who are very much in the midst of grief, even if we're not entirely aware of that.
Yeah.
So for me, grief literacy has become something about, just like you might want to learn hygiene in a new way, in a
Yeah.
new moment, that we may want to think about strategies of making information about how grieving works more broadly available and more broadly discussed. So I just
Mm.
think that's such a useful foundation then for, when an individual is then dealing with grief, that they're already embedded in a society that knows more than we know for the
Mm.
most part right now.
I really appreciate that perspective and bringing that into education, into
Yeah.
people that are working within the legal framework,
Yeah.
into people that are working in medical spaces
Yeah.
where grief is a little bit better understood, a little
Mhm.
bit more normalized,
Exactly.
maybe a little bit less medicalized,
Mhm.
that this
Mhm.
is a very very normal process
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
we're all going to have to go through, and
Yeah.
I think that you've created a great base for people to anybody that isn't. And I was actually thinking about how I was going to kind of put this podcast out there. And this is a great podcast to listen to anybody who isn't grieving also.
That's right.
Right?
Yes. And I would say, the word medicalize, it came out of my own mouth, and I have a variety of thoughts about that, because I like us to remember that, you think about like pregnancy. Pregnancy is not a disease.
Not
right?
a pathology.
It's not a pathology. But darned if you don't want some medical people who know how that goes,
Absolutely.
right? And this is why we have, prenatal care, right? Because we know this is a riskier time for medical complications. Bereavement is a riskier time for medical complications, even though it's a totally normal, natural process. We want to make sure that people have the education, the ability to sort of have self-surveillance. Is this normal? Am I, have I gotten outside the boundaries of what is a healthy medical physiology, regulation response? And we want the capacity for intervention, evidence-based intervention if someone is having an immune or cardiovascular reaction that's problematic.
Yes, and you actually drew attention to something that I thought was selling an idea that would not have come to me, which is it's a good time. That time of grieving is a good time to connect with your care providers.
That's right. Often when we've been caring for a loved one who's been ill, and often for a very long time, if we've been taking care of a dog who's sick or a parent who's sick, all of our mental energy has gone on the pharmacy runs and the questions for the doctor and the checking in, to see how they're doing and monitoring symptoms, and a lot of people haven't been to their regular annual checkup in more than a year, or they haven't had their mammogram or their colonoscopy or been to the dentist. And as a part of supporting the grieving body, just these normal health checks are important.
Yes, absolutely. And so thank you for that little bit of nuance, because I think that's really important. And I just want to thank you. I want to thank you for these books, because they're beautiful and they're informative and they're very kind. I mean, just really, really filled with kindness, I think, for those who are grieving in the moment and it's more acute, and for those of us that have experienced grief. And I think for those of us that want to support or just learn about grief.
Well, thank you, Kate, because it's this sort of dissemination, right? Bringing up this topic with so many people that increases our literacy.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Mary Frances, and I appreciate it. And The Grieving Body is out February 11th, which should be same date as this podcast. So it's out, and The Grieving Brain as well. And where else would you like people to find you?
You can find me on various social media, and at maryfrancesoconnor.org is where my lab lives.
Great. Well, Mary Frances, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast. If what you found resonated with you, may I ask that you share it with your friends or leave us a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts? This act of reciprocity helps others find Mind, Body, and Soil. If you're looking for more, you can find us at groundworkcollective.com and at Kate_Kavanaugh, that's KATE_KAVANAUGH on Instagram. I would like to give a very special thank you to China and Seth Kent of the band All Right, All Right for the clips from their beautiful song Over the Edge from their album The Crucible. You can find them at All Right, All Right on Instagram and wherever you listen to music.